Hello students, welcome to today's class. As we all know, we human beings are curious organisms. We seek to find reasons or causes for everything that happens around us. And like us are the psychological researchers who are also curious as to what are the various causes of mental disorders. Now, the earliest causation view of mental disorders which was put forward was the biological viewpoint, and hence researchers concentrated on biological causal factors. Now, the traditional biological viewpoint sees mental disorders or mental illnesses as diseases or dysfunctions of the brain or brain pathology, and it believes that these diseases and dysfunctions are caused by some kind of problems in the central nervous system or the autonomic nervous system or the endocrine system. Now, these problems may either be due to certain biological factors or may be due to certain physiological, genetic or inherited factors also. Only the symptoms of the mental disorders are cognitive, emotional or behavioral, whereas the causes are essentially physiological or caused by brain pathology. Now, this biological viewpoint received a very big breakthrough through one discovery. Now, what was this discovery? It was discovered in the early part of the 20th century that general paresis, which was still then considered to be a mental disorder and consisted of irreversible physical as well as mental degenerative changes, and the person died within 2 to 5 years. The biomedical model received an impetus when it was discovered that general paresis was actually an advanced case of brain syphilis and not simply a mental disorder. Now, this advance or this breakthrough gave a lot of prominence to the biological viewpoint. And many psychologists and many researchers started feeling that they could find simple biological reasons for most kinds of mental disorders, that every mental disorder could be traced to a biological causation. However, with the passage of time, psychologists and researchers have realized that this view is perhaps wrong, and they have come to recognize the role of social as well as psychological factors as causation factors in mental disorders, and hence we now have the biopsychosocial view, which takes into consideration biological, psychological as well as sociocultural causes for mental illness. In this class, we will be focusing solely on the biological causal factors for mental illness. Now, the biological causal factors for mental illness can be divided into 4 broad categories. Let us see what these categories are. The first consists of neurotransmitter or hormonal imbalances. The second category consists of genetic vulnerabilities. The third category is temperament, and the fourth category is brain plasticity or the flexibility of the brain to make changes in accordance with the external environment. Now, each of these categories of biological causation factors may either occur independently or they may occur in various combinations with each other and lead to mental illness. Now we come to the first biological causal factor, that is neurotransmitter imbalances. As we know, neurons or nerve cells are the basic units of the nervous system, and all our sensations and brain processes depend upon the messages or communication passed between neurons. Now, if you can have a look at the diagram, you will see the way the neural message passes from the dendrites of the neuron to the cell body, along the axon, and to the axon endings, from where it passes to other neurons. Now, this communication of nerve impulses or messages from one neuron to the other takes place through a small fluid-filled space between the two neurons, between the axon endings of one neuron and the dendrites of the other neuron. This fluid-filled space is called the synapse. Now, when a neural impulse reaches the axon endings of the transmitter neuron or the neuron which is transmitting the message, the axon endings release a chemical substance known as the neurotransmitter into the synapse. And it is through this chemical substance or the neurotransmitter that the message passes on to the dendrites of other neurons. Now, whether or not a neural impulse will happen depends upon a number of factors that belong to these neurotransmitters. For instance, some of the neurotransmitters released by the presynaptic neuron may be of a quality that they inhibit the neural impulse, whereas others may be of the quality that they aid the passage of the neural impulse from one neuron to the other. Similarly, the passage of messages from one neuron to the other, also the successful passage of messages from one neuron to the other, also depends upon the concentration of the neurotransmitter within the synapse. And a number of factors may bring about changes or imbalances in neurotransmitter functioning. This may include biological or physiological factors, or even psychological factors such as stress may influence neurotransmitter dysfunction. Now, what are these neurotransmitter imbalances? Let us have a look at some of the few. For instance, there may be an excessive production and release of the neurotransmitter into the synapse, and hence there is a functional excess or too much of the neurotransmitter in the synapse. This may be one source of imbalance. A second source of imbalance is that once the communication has passed from one neuron to the other, the remaining neurotransmitters need to be deactivated. Now, deactivation happens through two means. Either the neurotransmitter is taken back by the axon endings, that is neurotransmitter reuptake, or it is degraded by certain enzymes in the synapse. Any problems in this deactivation can lead to neurotransmitter imbalance. Now we come to a third cause of neurotransmitter imbalance. Now, receptors in the postsynaptic neuron which are receiving the messages from the presynaptic neuron may either be overly sensitive or insensitive, which may again create problems in the passage of neural messages. Now, neurons sensitive to a particular neurotransmitter tend to cluster together and form certain neural circuits or neural pathways between different parts of the brain. And different disorders are said to stem or said to be caused by imbalances in these neurotransmitters or by imbalances or dysfunctions of the chemical circuits. And various medical drug treatments which serve to cure or treat mental disorders actually act on these neurotransmitter imbalances. For instance, if you take antidepressant Prozac usually prescribed for depression, the action of Prozac involves prolonging the reuptake or degradation of serotonin in the synapse so that this neurotransmitter remains in the synapse for a longer time. Now, from the earliest times of medical advancement and anatomical and biological discoveries, a number of neurotransmitters have been identified, nearly hundreds of them. Now, out of these neurotransmitters, 4 neurotransmitters are particularly implicated as causal factors or as factors influencing mental disorders. Let us have a brief overview of these 4 neurotransmitters. The first neurotransmitter is norepinephrine. Now, this neurotransmitter, as we know, is released by the adrenal glands and has a very important role to play during stress reactions. Another neurotransmitter is dopamine. Now, dopamine has been implicated in schizophrenia as well as other addictive disorders. A third neurotransmitter is serotonin. Serotonin has important effects on the way in which we think, feel, and behave, as also on our emotional responses and emotional reactions. And hence, it has been implicated in anxiety, depression, stress, and often suicidal ideation. The fourth neurotransmitter is gamma-aminobutyric acid or GABA, which has an important role to play in reducing anxiety as well as controlling emotional states and emotional reactions caused by high arousal. Now we come to the second facet of this point, that is hormonal imbalances. As we know, our human body consists of several glands which release hormones and affect our behavior. The most important of these glands are the endocrine glands. Now, the endocrine glands release chemicals or hormones directly into the bloodstream, which affect the functioning of different organs and organ systems in our body. Now, the endocrine glands are connected in very prominent ways with the central nervous system, and this connection happens through the hypothalamus. This is because the hypothalamus is connected by the release of various chemicals to the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland is the master gland which releases a wide variety of hormones that control the functioning of all the other endocrine glands. Now, one important set of hormonal functions which are implicated in mental disorders is the kind of action that happens in the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal cortical axis. Now, what is this? When we are faced with a stressor, the hypothalamus immediately recognizes the stressful situation, and in order to prepare the body to deal with the stressor, it releases the corticotrophin releasing hormone. This corticotrophin releasing hormone, or CRH, immediately affects the pituitary gland. It causes the pituitary gland to release another hormone. This hormone is adrenocorticotrophic hormone, or ACTH. Now, the adrenocorticotrophic hormone immediately passes through the bloodstream and affects the adrenal glands, causing the release of cortisol as also the catecholamines epinephrine and norepinephrine. Now, once the levels of cortisol and the catecholamines increase in the blood, immediately they send a message back to the nervous system, back to the hypothalamus, that you must reduce the release of the chemical CRH so that the body balance is maintained. And this actually acts in the form of a thermostat which controls temperature, for instance. And the bodily balance is controlled. As the levels of cortisol and catecholamines increase, immediately a message passes back that reduces the release of CRH. Now, if this negative feedback system which goes from the body back to the brain is imbalanced in some way, a number of psychological dysfunctions can result. For instance, it is the imbalance in this negative feedback system which results in the prolonged effects of chronic stress such as depression, anxiety, and even post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, the second major group of hormonal influences is seen through the sex hormones. As we know, the gonadal hormones release a number of sex hormones which are particular to males as well as females. For instance, the androgens in the males and estrogen and progesterone in females. Now, actually, it is the release of these sex hormones that influences the development of our nervous systems right in the early stages of the development of human life. And it is because of their influence that differences in males and females and their behavior are constituted. If there are imbalances in the secretions of the gonadal hormones, it may lead to a number of maladaptive sexual behaviors and sexual ideas. Now that we have seen the importance of neurotransmitter imbalance and hormonal dysfunctions as causative factors for mental disorders, we'll now move on to a second causative factor, that is genetic vulnerability. Whenever we are talking of genetic vulnerability, you'll often recall terms such as chromosomes, DNA, and genes. Now, what are chromosomes? Chromosomes are chain-like structures comprising DNA molecules or molecules of DNA protein. DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid, and it has a major role to play in our genetic inheritance. Now, these long strands of DNA molecules contain genes which encompass our genetic or biological history which we have inherited from our parents and from our ancestors. Although no mental disorder is such that it is determined exclusively by the presence of certain genes, yet genes do have an influence on the causation of mental disorders. Now, the effects of certain genes can be seen directly right from childhood, such as temperamental effects. On the other hand, other genetic vulnerabilities leading to mental disorders often do not appear till the later stages in life, say adolescence, adulthood, or middle age, because that is usually the time when most mental disorders start. Now, as we know, every normal human cell has 46 chromosomes or 23 pairs of chromosomes. Now, in this 23 pairs of chromosomes, one chromosome from each pair comes from the father and the other from the mother. Of the 23 chromosomes, 22 chromosomes determine all our biological and physiological functioning, whereas one chromosome is the sex chromosome which determines sex. In the female, both the sex chromosomes are X chromosomes, hence the combination is XX, whereas in males, one chromosome is an X chromosome, whereas the other is the Y chromosome which comes from the father, and hence the combination is XY. Now, any kind of abnormalities in the structure or the number of chromosomes can result in marked forms of mental disorders and biological dysfunctions. For instance, if you see Down syndrome, which is characterized by mental retardation in children, it is caused by the trisomy of chromosome number 21. That is, in chromosome number 21, instead of the 2 chromosomes forming the pair, there are 3 chromosomes, and hence the result is the Down syndrome. Similarly, there may also be dysfunctions or anomalies in the sex chromosomes which can result in a variety of complications such as ambiguous sexual characteristics or ambiguous sexual behavior in the person. Fortunately, with the advance of genetics and with the advance of various fields of medical science, now it is possible to actually determine genetic influences and genetic vulnerabilities very early in life, even before the child is born. Now, most mental disorders are not caused just by chromosomal abnormalities, but are rather caused by abnormalities in the genes that reside on the chromosomes. Now, our genetic history is very important because it not only determines mental disorders to a large extent, but it also determines our uniqueness and individual differences, because no two individuals in the world possess the same genetic history except for identical twins. Now, although researchers may say that the gene for a particular disorder has been discovered and a new research has come forward, what we must understand is that most disorders cannot be traced back to a single gene, and most disorders are polygenic or caused by the action of a number of genes. Now, a person who is vulnerable to an abnormal disorder may actually inherit from his biological history or from his parents and ancestors a number of faulty genes. And these faulty genes may act in some pattern. They may interact with each other. They may act in an additive fashion where all their effects come together, leading to a number of imbalances in central nervous system functioning, in autonomic nervous system functioning, in the chemical balance of brain chemistry, as also in the secretion of hormones. And all these occurrences may occur at different parts of the lifetime and increase the individual's vulnerability to mental disorders. Now, what we must understand is that in the field of abnormal psychology, genetics does not play a simple, straightforward role. Or just because you possess a gene which increases your vulnerability to mental disorder, it does not guarantee that you will have the disorder at some point or the other. Now, whether or not the genes for a particular mental disorder actually create a disorder in the person depends a lot upon what kind of environment the person gets. And this environment is not only limited to the external environment during the lifetime, it also begins from the intrauterine environment before the child is born. And it depends upon the environment as to whether the genes for a particular disorder actually express themselves. This, in other words, means that just like we turn a switch on or off, genes can be turned on or off, depending upon what kind of environment is there. If the environment is conducive for the gene to express its abnormality, then yes, the person stands a chance of having the mental disorder. If the conditions are not suitable, then the person may actually escape the disorder. Now we come to two important concepts, that is genotype and phenotype. Now, what is a genotype? A person's total genetic endowment is referred to as his genotype. On the other hand, the observed structural, functional, and behavioral characteristics which result out of an interaction of the person's genotype and his environment is called his phenotype. Now, the person's genotype may actually correlate and influence his environment in a wide variety of ways which can lead to mental disorders. Say, for example, a child who has a genetic vulnerability or a predisposition towards aggression. For instance, since his preschool years, he may behave aggressively and hence he may face rejection from his peers. This may lead to an increase in aggression and hostility, and later he may tend to gang up with other delinquent peers, leading to the development of delinquency and antisocial personality disorder, possibly towards adulthood or adolescence. Or, for example, certain people who are at the genetic risk for depression tend to respond in different ways to stressful events than normal people. They tend to see stressful events as more threatening, and they see themselves as less capable of controlling the situation and may become depressed easily. One big example of the genotype environment correlation is the case of the disorder phenylketonuria, which can cause mental retardation in children. Children having PKU or phenylketonuria actually cannot metabolize food substances containing phenylalanine, and the environment can actually interact with this kind of genetic vulnerability. For instance, if you take care of the child's diet and avoid diet containing phenylalanine up to ages 5 or 6, phenylketonuria can actually be prevented. Now, with the development of molecular genetics and other such fields, a number of techniques for studying genetic vulnerabilities have come forward. Now, researchers in the field of abnormal psychology and its genetic causation mainly focus on three types of studies. The first is the family history or pedigree method, which focuses on whether the incidence of a particular disorder is more common among relatives or members of the same family as compared to other distinct populations. A second method is the twin method, which seeks to find out as to whether the incidence of mental disorders tends to be higher among identical twins because they have a 100% similar genetic history as compared to non-identical or dizygotic twins. A third category is the adoption method, where children who have been adopted from an early age are studied to see as to whether such children suffering from mental disorders have a greater correlation with their biological parents or with their adoptive parents. A greater correlation with the biological parents would actually mean similar genetic makeup and genetic causation for mental disorders. Now we come to the third biological factor causing mental disorders, and this is temperament. Temperament refers to our characteristic emotional responses and our tendencies for self-regulation in response to the environment. And we individuals differ widely in our temperament, right from early childhood. Babies having different temperaments actually react differently to various stimulations from the environment. For instance, some babies may be startled by even small sounds or changes in light when light falls on their faces. On the other hand, some may be happy, vigorous and active and actually may like such stimulation, or whereas a third category may actually be unaffected by such kind of stimulation. This temperament or our early temperament is the basis from which our personality, our adult personality grows. Starting at about even 3 months of age, 5 dimensions of temperament can be identified. Now, what are these 5 dimensions? The first is fearfulness. The second is irritability and frustration. The third is positive affect. The fourth is activity level. And the fifth is attentional persistence. Now, these 5 dimensions are said to relate to other dimensions of adult personality. For instance, fearfulness and irritability are said to be related to the adult dimension of neuroticism. Positive affect and activity are said to be related to the adult dimension of extraversion, whereas attentional persistence is said to be related to the adult dimension of control and conscientiousness. Now, temperament may actually lead to a number of gene-environment correlations in ways in which the person's temperament may influence the environment and possibly lead to the development of mental disorders. For instance, a child with a fearful temperament may lead to conditioned fear to a number of circumstances and situations, and as he grows up, he may learn to fear a number of social situations. On the other hand, a child who is extremely extroverted may seek out stimulation at any costs, and it may be very difficult to actually manage and control the child and teach him socially appropriate behavior. And if this behavior is uncontrolled and also fostered by certain kinds of undesirable environments such as hostile and aggressive environments, the stage is actually set for the possible development of antisocial personality disorder. Now, recent advances in neuroimaging techniques and other techniques for understanding the brain anatomy have showed that the functioning of the brain and the development of the brain is not so rigidly determined. It is not that once it is developed, it is developed. In fact, the brain shows a lot of possibility for flexibility and plasticity depending upon the individual's interactions with the environment. And a number of environmental factors, both prenatal environmental factors and postnatal environmental factors such as drugs, maturation, disease, pollution, fear, other psychological stressors can all bring about a number of changes in brain functioning and brain chemistry. Now, whether these changes are advantageous or not is another question. Some of these changes may be advantageous, others may actually be disadvantageous or detrimental. Now, there are several experiments which have been conducted which prove this. For instance, pregnant rats were actually put in a highly enriched environment and their offspring were found to be less vulnerable to brain injury. On the other hand, when they were put in an environment which was exposed to loud sounds, something which caused anxiety, their offspring were also found to be fearful and showed a large circulation of catecholamines or stress hormones. Also, the postnatal environment can affect development. For instance, again on experiments conducted in rats, enriched postnatal environment shows greater synaptic development, greater neuronal development, and thicker cell development in various areas of the cerebral cortex, and less vulnerability to mental disorders. Now, all these discoveries based on the studies on rats actually put forward the idea that children should be given as enriched an environment as possible. Although this is advantageous, let me remind you that normal adequate environments with caring parents is enough. It is not that if the environment is too enriched, the child will develop in an extremely positive way. A normal environment is enough for the child to develop normally. On the other hand, what should be kept in mind is that the environment should not pose dangers and problems in development. So in this chapter, basically we have seen 4 major biological causes for mental disorders, beginning with neurotransmitter and hormonal imbalances, then going on to genetic vulnerabilities, then we saw the role of temperament as a genetic factor, and finally we saw the capacity of the brain to change according to changes in the environment.